The tow truck lights flashed like a warning meant to humiliate him. Ethan watched from his porch as his car was dragged away, neighbors whispering while one woman smiled with victory. The HOA president had finally done it. She claimed his car violated a rule no one had ever enforced before. The notice appeared after the tow was already gone, taped crookedly to his door like an afterthought. Ethan stood there holding it, reading the words slowly, feeling heat rise in his chest. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. The promise she made that morning echoed in his head. She had leaned close and said this neighborhood would teach him respect. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply watched and listened, because he knew something she didn't. The driveway sat empty now, wide and clean, a space that suddenly felt like an invitation. Ethan walked inside, opened an old folder, and pulled out a contract signed months ago. He had planned to keep it quiet. He had planned to wait. But the tow changed everything. That night, the neighborhood slept peacefully, unaware that a choice had been made. Ethan stood at his window looking down the silent street, imagining the looks that would come next. He didn't want revenge. He wanted fairness. But if they insisted on pushing, he would respond in a way no one could ignore. By sunrise, the driveway would no longer be empty. And the HOA would realize they had underestimated the wrong homeowner. Morning arrived with the low rumble of an engine that didn't belong in a quiet suburb. Ethan stood calmly as the massive construction vehicle rolled into his driveway, steel tracks pressing into concrete with deliberate weight. It was legal, permitted, insured, and fully compliant. He had checked every rule twice. The irony made him smile. Neighbors stepped outside one by one, coffee cups frozen midair as they stared. Phones came out. Curtains moved. The driveway that had been used to shame him now demanded attention. The HOA president arrived quickly, her confident walk slowing when she saw the machine blocking the view of every house behind it. She began shouting before she reached the curb, listing rules, threats, and fines that sounded powerful but felt empty. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he handed her a printed copy of the bylaws with highlighted sections. The vehicle was temporary. The vehicle was registered. The vehicle was allowed. Her face tightened. This was not the reaction she expected. She demanded it be removed immediately, insisting she would handle it herself if he didn't comply. Ethan simply nodded and said he would wait for official notice. In writing, like she had taught him, by afternoon, the driveway had become a gathering point. Some neighbors whispered support. Others looked nervous. The HOA board members argued quietly near the sidewalk, realizing they were trapped by their own rules. The power they enjoyed depended on silence and fear, and both were slipping away. As the sun lowered, a tow truck slowed near the entrance, then drove past. No one wanted responsibility now. Ethan watched from his porch, knowing this was only the beginning. Tomorrow, the HOA would escalate, and when they did, they would expose something far bigger than a towed car. The next day began with a notice taped to Ethan's mailbox, bright red and intentionally dramatic. It listed violations that didn't exist, deadlines that weren't enforceable, and penalties that had no legal footing. Ethan read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a growing folder already thick with paperwork. He had learned long ago that control often depended on speed, not truth. By noon, the HOA called an emergency meeting. Chairs were set up in the community hall, and whispers filled the room before a single word was spoken. The construction vehicle had become a symbol, not of defiance, but of exposure. Ethan arrived quietly and sat in the back, letting the board speak first. They accused him of disrupting harmony, of intimidating neighbors, of abusing loopholes. Each claim was delivered with confidence, yet backed by nothing but raised voices. When it was Ethan's turn, he stood slowly and placed documents on the table. Permits. Emails. Bylaws. Dates. Names. Silence followed. One board member avoided eye contact. Another began flipping through pages too fast. The president interrupted, demanding the vehicle be removed for the good of the community. Ethan replied calmly that his car had been towed for the same reason. Fairness, he said, should work both ways. A murmur spread through the room. Neighbors exchanged looks. Someone asked why the tow notice had been issued without warning. Another asked why certain rules were enforced selectively. The meeting began to slip out of the board's control. By the time it ended, no vote was taken. No decision was made. The authority that once felt absolute now looked fragile. As people filed out, a neighbor quietly thanked Ethan for standing up. Outside, the construction vehicle sat unmoved, solid, and patient. Ethan knew the HOA wouldn't stop here. When power is challenged, it rarely retreats quietly. The silence after the meeting didn't last long. Within hours, emails began circulating, carefully worded but clearly panicked. The HOA board claimed they were reviewing procedures, yet new warnings appeared on doors across the neighborhood. It was no longer about Ethan. It was about control slipping away. Early the next morning, a tow truck crept into the street again, slow and deliberate. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as it paused near the construction vehicle. The driver stepped out, phone pressed to his ear, then shook his head and climbed back inside. The truck left without touching anything. Word traveled faster than the engine sound. That afternoon, Ethan received a certified letter demanding fines for unauthorized obstruction. He smiled slightly and added it to his folder. Every move they made now only strengthened his position. He hadn't escalated anything. He had simply mirrored their actions with permission they never expected him to have. The board called for mediation, framing it as a peaceful solution. Ethan agreed, knowing refusal would only feed their narrative. The session was tense but revealing. When asked to justify the original tow, the HOA representative hesitated. Records were missing. Notices were unclear. Authority blurred into assumption. A mediator asked a simple question: why was enforcement uneven? No one answered directly. The room felt smaller with each passing second. Ethan remained calm. Hands folded, letting the truth surface on its own. Outside the building, neighbors waited. When Ethan emerged, several approached him, not with complaints, but with gratitude. Some shared stories of fines they never understood. Others admitted fear of speaking up. As the sun dipped lower, Ethan returned home. The construction vehicle still stood in his driveway, unchanged. But the neighborhood felt different now. What had once been quiet compliance was turning into awareness. And awareness, Ethan knew, was far harder to tow away. By the end of the week, the HOA's tone changed completely. The emails stopped sounding official and started sounding defensive. Phrases like misunderstanding and clerical error appeared again and again. What once felt like authority now felt like panic wearing a suit. The board scheduled an emergency neighborhood meeting, hoping to regain control before things slipped further. That evening, chairs filled faster than anyone expected. Homeowners who never attended meetings before showed up, whispering to each other, holding old notices in fine letters. When the board members took their seats, the room went quiet. There was no applause, no friendly chatter. Just waiting. Ethan wasn't the first to speak. A retired couple stood up and described how their guest's car had been towed without warning. A single mother shared how fines piled up after she questioned a rule that never existed in writing. Each story landed heavier than the last. The board tried to interrupt, but the crowd wouldn't let them. When Ethan finally spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply explained what happened, step by step, showing documents, permits, and dates. The construction vehicle wasn't revenge. It was proof. Proof that rules only mattered when the board wanted them to. A board member suggested a vote to move forward. Someone from the back laughed. Others shook their heads. The idea that things could simply reset no longer made sense. Outside, a local news van pulled up, lights flashing softly. Someone had called them. Cameras changed everything. Smiles vanished. Carefully practiced confidence disappeared. As the meeting ended, no decisions were made, but something irreversible had happened. The HOA no longer controlled the story. The neighborhood did. And Ethan understood this was no longer about his driveway. It was about accountability finally pulling into view. The next morning felt different. The neighborhood was quieter, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, when everyone is waiting to see what damage remains. Ethan stepped outside and noticed something unusual. The warning notices that once dotted mailboxes were gone. No cones. No tape. Just empty posts where authority used to hang. By noon, the HOA president sent a formal letter requesting a private meeting. The wording was careful, almost apologetic. Gone were threats and deadlines. In their place were words like resolution and mutual understanding. Ethan agreed to attend, not out of fear, but curiosity. Inside the HOA office, the walls were covered with framed rules and smiling group photos from better years. The board members looked smaller now, like actors after the curtain falls. They explained that recent events had attracted attention from the city. An audit was coming. Records would be reviewed. Decisions questioned, then came the offer. Fines erased. Past violations dismissed. A written apology. All if Ethan agreed to keep things quiet. He listened without interrupting, then calmly declined. Silence, he explained, was how this problem grew in the first place. Accountability needed daylight. The board exchanged nervous glances. One of them asked what he wanted instead. Ethan asked for transparency. Public records. Open meetings. Clear rules applied equally. Nothing more. When he left the office, his phone buzzed. The local news clip was already online. Comments poured in from strangers who had lived the same story in different neighborhoods. The issue was bigger than one HOA now. As evening settled in, Ethan looked down his driveway at the construction vehicle still parked there. It no longer felt like a statement of defiance. It felt like a marker. A line between what was tolerated before and what would never be accepted again. By the end of the week, everything had changed. The audit became official. City inspectors walked through the neighborhood with clipboards, asking questions no one had ever dared to ask before. HOA emails stopped completely. The authority that once felt absolute now looked fragile, built on fear rather than fairness. Ethan never celebrated. He simply returned his life to normal. The construction vehicle was moved back to the site at dawn, quietly, without applause. Yet its impact remained. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved. Some stopped to thank him. Others admitted they had been afraid to speak up for years. At the next public meeting, the HOA board announced resignations. New elections were scheduled. Rules would be rewritten with legal oversight. Transparency was no longer a suggestion, it was a requirement. The neighborhood breathed again, not because one man won, but because intimidation lost its grip. Ethan stood at the edge of his driveway that evening, watching the sun dip behind familiar rooftops. He realized the real victory wasn't revenge or embarrassment. It was balance. Respect. The simple truth that power only works when people believe in it. What began with a towed car ended with a community waking up. And the lesson was clear: standing your ground doesn't always mean shouting louder. Sometimes, it means refusing to back down calmly. Until the truth has no choice but to surface, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.